German Chancellor Friedrich Merz says that Ukraine's allies have now lifted all restrictions on Ukrainian forces attacking Russia with long-range missiles supplied by the West, a decision the Kremlin has called dangerous. Russian President Vladimir Putin had previously threatened war with NATO if long-range weapons supplied by the West were used against Russia. This follows, of course, a weekend of massive Russian drone and missile strikes across Ukraine. That prompted U.S. President Donald Trump to say that Putin had, quote, gone crazy. Chancellor Merz, meantime, is hoping President Trump's words could possibly lead to some concrete action.
Und ist übers Wochenende offensichtlich.
Trump is obviously increasingly disillusioned with Putin due to the massive attacks on Kyiv and other cities in Ukraine over the weekend. In this respect, I hope that America stays on board.
Die Frage ist, ob die USA sich.
The question is whether the USA will continue to see it as its political and military duty to help Ukraine, and that is what we are trying to achieve.
In the latest round of attacks, Russia hit the Sumy and Donetsk regions, killing at least 2 people. CNN military analyst and retired Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton joins me now from Washington. Colonel Leighton, good to see you. Those comments from Donald Trump, of course, where he said he thought that Putin had changed. This is not the Putin that he knows. He's known him for some time. There was some head scratching over those comments because to most, this was the Vladimir Putin that had been here all along. As we watch the fallout from these comments, what is the impact, do you think, on the war itself?
Oh, good to be with you, Erica. Yeah, I think the impact on the war is going to be multifaceted. One aspect of this is that this is basically Trump's realization, I guess we'll call it, that Putin is doing evil things, at least his partial realization, may very well pave the way for further use of U.S. aid in this war. However, it could branch off into another way where Trump will wash his hands of everything. So the German Chancellor's comments become, I think, quite interesting in the sense that he is definitely looking for the U.S. to continue its support. The Europeans are trying very hard to step up, but they are also counting on the U.S. to do its share, in essence, to maintain some of the weapons deliveries and munitions deliveries and intelligence support that the U.S. has provided in the past. So it could very well, in one sense, it could, make the war more survivable, if you will, for the Ukrainians. On the other hand, it could also eventually draw the Russians closer to the negotiating table. And that, of course, is the hope of Chancellor Merz and others who he does.
And it was an interesting word choice on the part of the Chancellor talking about the U.S. duty there and how the U.S. would choose to follow that. It's also, as we watch what has been this real intensifying on the part of Russia in terms of attacks over the last several days. Do you see this as Russia trying to maybe see how far it can push Donald Trump in some ways?
Yeah, I think that is part of it, Erica. One aspect of this, could be from a military perspective that they're in essence trying to soften up Ukrainian targets for a summer offensive that a lot of us think will actually happen, that the Russians will try to engage in. But the Russians are clearly testing Trump. They're clearly testing the West. They've been doing that really since the beginning of this phase of the conflict. And it seems to me that they are going to continue to do this as much as they can. Now, one possible outcome of this is that the Russians will more quickly deplete their weapons as they conduct these attacks. But on the other side of that is the fact that the Russians have actually made their economy a wartime economy and basically increased their production capacity substantially. So if there are any diminutions in the ability of the Russians to conduct attacks like this, I think they might be short-lived.
As we look at how this is playing out, the fact that, Chancellor Merz was talking about Ukraine can now defend itself using these long-range missiles to fire into Russia, the Kremlin responding, calling this dangerous. And then I thought it was interesting that Merz said, hey, this has been the case for months. The fact that it's being said out loud, though, what does that change?
Well, I think Merz is, in some ways, he's at least publicly distancing himself with what his predecessor, former Chancellor Olaf Scholz, did. Scholz was very clear that, at least in his public pronouncements, that German weapons could not be used for long-range attacks into Russia. But the new policy under Chancellor Merz is that, in essence, the Germans are mirroring what the French, the British, and the U.S. Have done in the past with systems like the Storm Shadow and the ATACMS HIMARS missile systems. So that basically brings the Germans up to the same standard, if you will. Now the question remains, will the Germans provide one of their weapon systems, which would be extremely useful for the Ukrainians, and that would be the Taurus missile. If they provide the Taurus, that could be a potential game changer, at least in the short run, for the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians would certainly welcome that.
Colonel Cedric Leighton, always appreciate your insight. Thank you.
With us now, CNN global affairs analyst Kim Dozier. Kim, so these restrictions, which the German chancellor is talking about, in weapons that were given to Ukraine by the United States and allies for a long time, and President Biden wanted this too, wanted restrictions, didn't want Ukraine to be able to shoot them deep into Russia or wherever they wanted. Now the German chancellor says, have at it. What difference could that make?
Yeah, doing this in defiance or without seeking the permission of the Trump administration. This means that they can use these weapons. The Ukrainians can hit Russian supply lines, Russian command and control nodes, the same kind of things that the Russians are doing to the Ukrainians. It levels the playing field somewhat, but what they really need is permission to do the same thing with all the U.S. directly supplied weaponry. And they need continuing supplies to be able to continue to prosecute the fight, as Russian troops are apparently readying for a summer offensive.
And whether those supplies continue in the numbers that they have over the last 3 years, that's one of the major questions now, facing Ukraine, really facing the world. President Trump expressed surprise over the weekend that Vladimir Putin and Russia continues to attack Ukraine. What does that tell you? If he's really surprised, what does that tell you?
That every time Putin talks to him, as he did last week in a long 2-hour-plus conversation, Putin manages to convince Trump that he is taking some steps towards negotiation, towards ceasefire. The Kremlin has said that they're about to come out with a memo that Putin promised Trump last week on how they would go forward with a ceasefire, but it keeps not happening. And Trump's tweet over the weekend got dismissed by the Kremlin as emotional.
Yeah.
When you talk to Ukrainians and Europeans about this, they're like, when is he going to get it that Putin is playing him? Is he afraid of Putin? He seems to be as risk averse as Biden was, fearful that Putin might use nuclear weapons.
And President Trump is said to be considering new sanctions against Russia. Nothing definite at this point. How much would new sanctions make a difference?
The sanctions would be symbolic but important for morale on the ground in Ukraine. They would be doing things like the Senator Lindsey Graham package that's being considered on Capitol Hill would hit China, India, and the EU for buying oil, gas, and uranium from Russia. So that would stop some of the money that's keeping the Russian war machine going. But it's not enough, because at this point the Russians have so increased their weapons production capacity that they're actually storing weapons up to use in the future on the battlefield. And that's bad news for Ukraine.
It is ominous. All right, Kim Dozier, thank you very much.